August 15th, 1992. Tank Morrison had been a Nevada Highway Patrol officer for 8 years when he pulled into Mickey's Gas and Go at 2:47 a.m. What he saw in those fluorescent lights changed everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. 5 Hells Angels had Mike Tyson pinned against a Dodge pickup. The heavyweight champion of the world, hands zip-tied behind his back, blood streaming from his nose. That's when Iron Mike smiled. What happened in the next 4 minutes left Tank with a choice no cop should ever have to make. 4 bodies, 1 story, and a secret that would haunt 2 men for 30 years. The Nevada State Police closed the case in 6 hours, called it self-defense. But Tank knew better. He'd seen Tyson's hands when they cut those zip ties. They weren't the hands of a victim. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tank Morrison's hands hadn't stopped shaking for 3 decades. He stared at those same hands now, liver-spotted and arthritic, wrapped around a lukewarm Coors Light at 10:30 in the morning. The living room of his dead wife's house felt like a mausoleum, her reading glasses still on the coffee table, her romance novel stacked by the window, her coffee mug in the sink growing mold for the past 6 months since the cancer finally won. The phone sat on the kitchen counter like a loaded gun. It had been ringing every day for a week. Same time, 10:15 a.m. Tank knew who it was before he even looked at the caller ID. Only one person alive had this number besides his daughter in Portland, and she hadn't called since the funeral. Dake Eyes Peterson, the last surviving member of the Reno chapter of the Hells Angels, the only man who walked away from Mickey's Gas and Go that night in 1992. The only other person who knew what really happened when the fluorescent lights flickered off and on like a broken strobe, casting shadows that looked like death. Tank took another sip of beer and let it ring. 7 times, 8, then silence. His pension check sat unopened on the kitchen table next to a stack of medical bills from Carol's final months. 23 years with the Nevada Highway Patrol. Spotless record. 3 commendations for bravery. 1 Medal of Valor for pulling a family from a burning car wreck during the '08 floods. None of it meant shit when you'd built your entire career on a lie. The house creaked in the desert wind. Tank closed his eyes and he was back there again. The smell of gasoline and motor oil, the hum of dying fluorescent bulbs, the sound of knuckles cracking against bone. He could still hear Tyson's voice, calm as Sunday morning, asking Snake Eyes which finger he wanted to keep. "You boys came here for a reason," Tyson had said, cutting his own zip ties with a switchblade that appeared from nowhere. "Let's finish what we started." Tank should have called for backup the moment he saw them, should have drawn his weapon, should have done 100 things differently. Instead, he'd crouched behind his patrol car and watched the heavyweight champion of the world systematically dismantle 4 men with his bare hands. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. The zip ties hadn't been real. They were props, stage magic for Tank's benefit. The blood on Tyson's face was someone else's. And when it was over, when 4 bodies lay twisted on the concrete and Snake Eyes was begging for his life, Tyson had looked directly at Tank through the gas station window and smiled. That same smile from the ring. The one that said he knew something you didn't. "Officer Morrison," Tyson had called out, his voice carrying across the empty lot. "Why don't you come inside? We need to talk." Tank's phone buzzed. Text message. "Time's running out, Tank. We both know you're going to answer eventually. Cancer's got me by the balls, but I ain't dying with this on my conscience. 24 hours. Then I start talking to people who'll listen." Tank deleted the message, but the words burned behind his eyelids. Snake Eyes had kept quiet for 30 years because Tyson had made him a promise that night. Stay silent and live. Talk and join his brothers in whatever hole they dug for them outside Reno. But dying men stopped caring about threats. The beer tasted like aluminum and regret. Tank walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the empty Nevada landscape, all scrub brush and broken dreams stretching to the horizon. He'd moved out here after retirement, as far from Reno as possible while still staying in state. 37 miles from the nearest neighbor. 42 miles from the nearest sheriff's station, far enough that no one would hear the gunshot when he finally worked up the courage. Carol used to ask him about that night. Not directly, she was too smart for that. But she'd catch him staring at his hands during dinner, or wake up to find him sitting in the garage at 3 a.m., cleaning a service weapon that was already spotless. Whatever happened out there, she'd told him once, it's eating you alive. She was right. Tank had solved murders, worked drug busts, faced down armed suspects and drunk drivers and domestic abusers. But nothing had prepared him for what he'd seen at Mickey's Gas and Go. Nothing had prepared him for the choice Tyson had given him when the killing was done. Two stories we can tell here, officer. The truth, which no one will believe, or something simpler, something that keeps us both breathing. Your call. Tank had made his choice. He'd helped Tyson stage the scene, practiced the story until it sounded real, watched the investigation get buried under media attention and political pressure. Mike Tyson defending himself against 5 bikers? Case closed. Hero story. Feel-good ending. The phone started ringing again. This time, Tank Morrison walked to the kitchen and picked it up. Tommy. The voice on the other end was a whisper wrapped in sandpaper, barely recognizable as human. Lung cancer had reduced Snake Eyes Peterson to a ghost of the man who used to run methamphetamines from Bakersfield to Salt Lake City. Tank had arrested him twice in the 80s, once for assault, once for possession with intent. Both charges disappeared into legal black holes, the kind of plea bargains that made cops like Tank question why they bothered. Snake, you know why I'm calling. Tank's free hand found Carol's reading glasses on the counter, running his thumb along the worn plastic frames. She'd been reading Pride and Prejudice again before the chemo made her too weak to hold a book. Her bookmark was still pressed between pages 247 and 248, marking the spot where Elizabeth Bennet finally sees Mr. Darcy clearly. Carol always said that was her favorite part, when the truth comes out and changes everything. I know you're dying, Tank said. Doesn't mean I have to listen. A wet cough echoed through the receiver, the sound of a man drowning from the inside out. Doctors give me 6 weeks, maybe 8 if I'm unlucky. Tank walked to the living room, phone pressed to his ear. Carol's coffee cup sat on the end table where she'd left it that last morning, lipstick stain still visible on the rim. Revlon Red Passion 440. He'd bought her a tube every Christmas for 26 years, never understanding why she bothered with makeup when she was beautiful without it. That's your problem, not mine. You ever wonder why we were there that night? Snake's voice carried a wheeze that sounded like wind through broken glass. 5 of us, middle of nowhere, waiting for one man? Tank had wondered. For 30 years he'd wondered. But questioning the official story meant pulling a thread that would unravel everything: his career, his pension, his marriage. Carol had died believing she was married to a hero cop, not a man who'd helped cover up 4 murders. Ancient history. Bullshit. Another coughing fit, worse this time. When it subsided, Snake's breathing sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. You know what I've been doing since I got the diagnosis? Reading. Amazing what you can find in old newspapers when you got time to look. Tank sank into Carol's recliner, the one that still smelled like her lavender lotion and the peppermint tea she drank during her final weeks. The fabric had molded to her shape over the years, and sitting in it felt like being held by a ghost. Enlighten me. Jessica Hartwell, 17 years old, disappeared from a Las Vegas casino party 3 days before our little gas station encounter. Rich Daddy connections all the way to Carson City. Case went cold faster than a whore's heart. The name hit Tank like a physical blow. Jessica Hartwell. He remembered the missing person bulletin, the statewide bolo alert. Pretty blonde girl from a prominent family vanished without a trace. The kind of case that generated heat and headlines until it suddenly didn't. What's that got to do with anything? Everything. Snake's laugh turned into another coughing spasm. We weren't there to rob Tyson, Tommy. We were there because someone paid us to be. Someone who knew exactly when and where he'd be stopping that night. Tank's mouth went dry. Through the kitchen window, he could see Carol's garden slowly dying in the desert heat. She'd planted roses that first year, determined to bring beauty to this desolate place. They'd struggled for 3 seasons before finally taking root, blooming blood red against the brown landscape. You're hallucinating. Cancer's in your brain. Wish it was that simple. Paper rustled in the background. Got bank records, Tank. $50,000 wired to our club's account the day before Jessica disappeared. Another 50 the morning after our boys died. Blood money, split 5 ways, except only one of us lived to spend it. Tank closed his eyes and saw Carol in her hospital bed, yellow as old paper, asking him to promise he'd find peace after she was gone. He'd lied to her then, just like he'd been lying to himself for 3 decades. Peace wasn't possible when you'd built your life on quicksand. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired of carrying it alone. Because that girl deserves better than being forgotten in some unmarked grave. And because you're the only other person who saw what really happened in that gas station. Outside, a coyote picked its way through Carol's dead roses, searching for something that wasn't there. Tank watched it nose around the irrigation system he'd never bothered to maintain. Another promise broken to another ghost. What do you want from me? Snake's breathing grew labored, each word a struggle. Meet me tomorrow night. Mickey's Gas and Go. Midnight. That place has been closed for 15 years. Perfect. Time we finished what we started. The line went dead, leaving Tank alone with the dial tone and 30 years of buried truth clawing its way toward the surface. Tank stared at the dead phone in his hand for a full minute before setting it down. The silence in Carol's house felt different now, heavier, charged with the electricity that comes before a storm. He'd spent 30 years building walls around that night, brick by brick, lie by lie. Snake Eyes had just taken a sledgehammer to the foundation. He walked back to the kitchen and opened another beer, his third of the morning. The aluminum can felt cold against his palm, the only solid thing in a world that had just tilted off its axis. Jessica Hartwell. He hadn't thought about that name in decades, but now it echoed in his skull like a prayer or a curse. Tank pulled his old service laptop from the hall closet, blowing dust off the keyboard. Carol had bought it for him 3 Christmases ago, thinking he might want to write his memoirs. "You've got stories worth telling," she'd said, not knowing that the only story worth telling was the one he could never write. The internet connection crawled like everything else in this desert wasteland, but eventually the Nevada State Archives loaded. Tank typed Jessica Hartwell missing 1992 into the search bar and waited. The first result made his stomach drop through the floor. Casino heiress vanished after private party. Las Vegas Sun, October 15, 1992. The photograph showed a teenage girl with honey blonde hair and her father's political smile. She was wearing a blue evening dress, standing next to a man Tank recognized immediately, Nevada State Senator Richard Hartwell, chairman of the Gaming Commission, the same commission that regulated boxing matches in Nevada, the same commission that had ultimate authority over Mike Tyson's fighting license. Tank's hands began their familiar tremor as he read the article. Jessica Hartwell had disappeared from a private party at the Mirage Casino on October 12, 1992. The guest list included high-ranking politicians, casino executives, and several professional athletes. The investigation had been handled personally by Las Vegas Metro's elite unit, but no arrests were ever made. The case file was sealed by judicial order after 6 months. 3 days later, Tank had watched 5 Hells Angels die at Mickey's Gas and Go. He scrolled through more articles, watching the story evolve. Initial reports mentioned persons of interest being questioned, but those references disappeared from later coverage. The family had offered a $100,000 reward, then quietly withdrew it after 2 weeks. Senator Hartwell had announced his retirement from politics 6 months later, citing personal reasons. Tank clicked on the last article, dated November 3, 1992. Hartwell family requests privacy as search continues. Reno Gazette-Journal. This photo was different. Senator Hartwell looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. His wife stood beside him, clutching a tissue, her eyes hollow with the kind of grief that never heals. Behind them, barely visible in the background, stood a familiar figure in an expensive suit. Don King's distinctive hair was unmistakable. Tank's beer can hit the floor, foam spreading across Carol's linoleum. Don King had been Tyson's promoter, his handler, his keeper of secrets. If King was at a Hartwell family press conference, it wasn't a coincidence. The laptop screen flickered as Tank opened a new search. Don King, Mike Tyson, 1992 Nevada Gaming Commission. The results painted a picture that made his blood run cold. Tyson had been in trouble with the commission that year. Sexual assault allegations were mounting, his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, and there were rumors that his fighting license might be suspended. Senator Hartwell, as commission chairman, held Tyson's career in his hands. Tank's fingers moved across the keyboard with growing desperation. Mike Tyson, October 1992 schedule. Most results showed canceled appearances and postponed training sessions, but buried in the sports section of the Reno Gazette was a small item that made Tank's vision blur. Tyson training camp moved to secret location. Former champions team cites security concerns. The article was dated October 16, 1992, the day after Jessica Hartwell's disappearance, the day before Tank had encountered Tyson at the gas station. Tank closed the laptop and sat back in Carol's chair, processing the implications. A senator's daughter vanishes. 3 days later, 5 bikers are paid to ambush the man who might have information about her disappearance. The ambush turns into a massacre. The surviving biker keeps quiet for 30 years. Until now, Tank's phone buzzed with another text message from Snake Eyes. "You found it, didn't you?" The connection. Girl went to that party looking for excitement, found something else instead. Tyson knows where she ended up. So do I. Tank's hands weren't just shaking now, they were convulsing. He tried to type a response, but his fingers wouldn't obey. Everything he'd believed about that night, every rationalization he'd used to sleep at night, was collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. The truth was simpler and more terrible than he'd imagined. Those 5 men hadn't been there to rob Mike Tyson. They'd been there to make him disappear. And when that plan failed, when the predator became the prey, someone had made sure the survivors would never talk. Tank looked at the phone in his shaking hands, knowing that answering Snake Eyes' call had already sealed his fate. The old biker was right about one thing. There was no going back now. The equilibrium was broken. The reckoning had begun. Tank shoved the laptop away like it was contaminated, sending Carol's reading glasses skittering across the table. He needed air, space, distance from the poison that was seeping through his screen and into his carefully constructed world. The garage. Carol's car was still there, a 2010 Honda Civic that he couldn't bring himself to sell. It smelled like her perfume and the vanilla air fresheners she bought in bulk from Costco. Tank sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, trying to convince himself that Snake Eyes was lying. Dying men said crazy things. Cancer ate brains. This was desperation, not truth. His phone rang. Not Snake Eyes this time. The caller ID showed a number he hadn't seen in 15 years. Morrison. Tank? Jesus, is that really you? The voice belonged to Detective Ray Kowalski, Las Vegas Metro. They'd worked a joint task force back in '94, tracking gun runners between Reno and Vegas. Kowalski was good police, thorough, honest, the kind of cop who stayed late to dot every I and cross every T. He'd also been the lead investigator on the Jessica Hartwell case. Ray been a while. "Yeah, well, retirement's treating you better than me, I bet." Kowalski's laugh sounded forced. "Listen, I got a weird call this morning, some guy claiming to have information about an old case of mine. Real old. He mentioned your name." Tank's throat felt like he'd swallowed sand. "What kind of information?" "Didn't say. But here's the thing. This case file, it's been sealed tighter than Fort Knox for 30 years. Nobody even knows it exists anymore. So how does this guy know to call about it? How does he know your name was ever connected?" Through the garage window, Tank watched a dust devil spiral across his dead lawn. Carol used to say the desert was honest. It showed you exactly what it was. No pretense or false promises. Unlike people, what was the case? A long pause. "You know what case, Tank?" Tank closed his eyes. Kowalski had always been too smart for his own good. "I haven't thought about Jessica Hartwell in decades." "Bullshit. You don't forget cases like that one. Rich girl, political connections, pressure from every direction to make it go away." Kowalski's voice dropped to a whisper. "I never told you this, but I had a suspect. Good suspect. Evidence that would have stuck. What happened to him?" Orders came down from the top. "Stand down. Case reassigned to federal jurisdiction. File sealed by judicial order." My captain wouldn't even look me in the eye when he delivered the news. Another pause. 2 weeks later, I got promoted and transferred to Vice. Nice bump in pay, cushy assignment, message received. Tank thought about his own promotion after the gas station incident. Detective to sergeant, Reno to Carson City. Clean record, fresh start, no questions asked about that night when 4 men died and the official report barely filled 2 pages. Why are you telling me this? Because 30 years later, I'm still a cop. And cops don't like unsolved murders, especially when the victim was 17 years old. Kowalski's breathing grew heavy. This guy who called, he's dying. Cancer. Says he's got information that could break the case wide open, but he'll only talk to you. Tank's hand cramped around the phone. I can't help you. Can't or won't. Same difference. Tank, listen to me. I did some digging after that call. Pulled strings I probably shouldn't have pulled. That case file? It's not just sealed, it's protected. Federal protection, the kind reserved for national security shit. What the hell was a teenage girl involved in that required that level of secrecy? Tank knew the answer, but speaking it would be like lighting a fuse on dynamite. Jessica Hartwell wasn't just any senator's daughter. She was leverage, insurance, a bargaining chip in a game played by men who collected politicians like trading cards and thought murder was just another business expense. I'm retired, Ray. Ancient history. Ancient history that's starting to talk. This guy, he's scared, really scared. Kept asking if I thought anyone was listening to our conversation, said there were people who'd kill to keep this quiet. Kowalski paused. People who already have killed. Tank's reflection stared back at him from the Honda's rearview mirror. An old man with dead eyes and shaking hands. Carol had taken this picture of him on their wedding day, young and strong in his dress uniform. She'd kept it clipped to the sun visor, said it reminded her why she fell in love with a cop. Now it just reminded him of everything he'd lost. Ray, forget you got that call. Forget my name came up. Walk away. Can't do that, Tank. Not this time. The line went dead. Tank sat in Carol's car, surrounded by the ghost of her vanilla air fresheners and the weight of 30 years' worth of buried truth clawing its way toward the surface. His phone buzzed. Another text from Snake Eyes. Your cop friend sounds worried. He should be... Tank stared at the text message until the words burned into his retinas. Snake Eyes wasn't just dying, he was watching, listening. How long had the old biker been monitoring his communications? How deep did this surveillance go? The Honda's interior suddenly felt like a coffin. Tank stumbled out of the garage and back into the kitchen, where Carol's laptop still sat open like an accusation. The photos of Jessica Hartwell seemed to follow him with their eyes. 17 years old, bright smile, whole life ahead of her. Until someone decided she'd seen too much. Tank poured 3 fingers of bourbon into Carol's favorite coffee mug, the one with "World's Best Wife" printed in fading letters. She'd bought it for herself as a joke their first Christmas, back when they still believed police work was about justice instead of damage control. The bourbon burned his throat, but it was nothing compared to the fire eating through his chest. Another text arrived. Check your mailbox. Tank's hand froze halfway to his mouth. The mailbox sat 50 yards from the house, a rusty monument to isolation. He hadn't checked it in 3 days. Hadn't been expecting anything except bills and the sympathy cards that still trickled in 6 months after Carol's funeral. He walked outside barefoot, gravel cutting into his soles. The desert heat shimmered off the asphalt like liquid mercury, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the wasteland, the loneliest sound in the world. The mailbox contained the usual junk and 1 manila envelope with no return address. Tank's name was written in block letters across the front, the handwriting careful and deliberate. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note. The photo showed Jessica Hartwell at what looked like a private party. She was laughing, holding a champagne glass, surrounded by older men in expensive suits. Tank recognized 2 faces immediately. Don King, unmistakable with his shock of white hair, and another man whose presence made Tank's blood turn to ice water. Mike Tyson. Not the public Tyson, the showman who played up his lisp and cultivated his bad boy image for the cameras. This was a different man entirely. His eyes held a predatory intelligence that seemed to calculate the exact value of everything in the room, including the 17-year-old girl at the center of attention. The note was brief. She trusted the wrong people. So did you... Tank's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the gravel driveway, photograph trembling in his hands. Jessica Hartwell hadn't been a random kidnapping victim. She'd been at parties with these men, parties where senators' daughters rubbed shoulders with boxing promoters and heavyweight champions, parties where teenage girls learned that some secrets were too dangerous to survive. His phone rang. This time he almost didn't answer. "You see it now, don't you?" Snake Eye's voice was weaker than before, each word a struggle. The whole picture. Girl goes to parties with the wrong crowd, sees things she shouldn't see, decides maybe she wants out, maybe she threatens to talk. Can't have that kind of liability walking around. Tank tried to speak but could only manage a croak. What happened to her? What do you think happened? Girl disappears. 3 days later we get paid to make sure nobody can connect the dots. Except you and Tyson walked out of that gas station and we didn't. A wet cough. Funny how that worked out. Tyson killed 4 men in self-defense. Did he? Or did he kill 4 men who could testify that he was supposed to disappear that night? That the whole thing was a setup to eliminate everyone who knew about the girl? Tank's vision blurred. The photograph slipped from his fingers and landed face up on the gravel, Jessica's smile now a mockery under the merciless sun. He thought about that night 30 years ago, how prepared Tyson had seemed, how efficiently he'd moved, how calmly he'd surveyed the carnage afterward. You don't know what you're saying. I know I've been carrying this alone for 3 decades. I know I took blood money and kept my mouth shut because I was scared. I know that girl's parents went to their graves without knowing what happened to their daughter. Snake's breathing turned ragged. And I know you filed a report that night that was complete bullshit. Tank closed his eyes and saw Carol in her wedding dress, radiant with hope and trust. She'd married a man she believed was honorable. She'd died believing that lie. What do you want from me? Truth. Justice. All that Boy Scout shit you used to believe in before you learned it doesn't pay the bills. Another coughing fit, more violent this time. Meet me tomorrow night, Tank. Mickey's Gas and Go. Midnight. Time to finish what we started. That place is a crime scene. Was a crime scene. Now it's just another dead spot in the desert, like everything else out here. Snake's laugh turned into a death rattle. Fitting place for a confession, don't you think? The line went dead. Tank sat in the gravel, holding a photograph of a murdered girl and the weight of 30 years' worth of lies. The truth wasn't going to set anyone free. It was going to destroy what little was left of the world he'd built on quicksand and blood money. But Carol had always said the truth was worth fighting for, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Tank stumbled back inside, clutching the photograph like evidence of his own damnation. Carol's kitchen felt foreign now. The yellow walls she'd painted with such hope, the ceramic roosters she'd collected at flea markets, the cross-stitch sampler that read "Bless this house," everything wholesome and clean and honest, everything he'd polluted with his presence. He spread the photo on the table next to the laptop and stared at it until his eyes watered. Something was wrong with the image. Not wrong, but incomplete. The angle suggested the photographer was hidden, shooting from across the room. This wasn't a party photo. It was surveillance. Tank grabbed Carol's magnifying glass from the junk drawer and examined the background. There, barely visible behind Don King's shoulder, was another familiar face. Someone Tank hadn't seen in the original scan, someone his mind had refused to process. Detective Ray Kowalski. 30 years younger, clean-shaven, wearing an expensive suit that no honest cop could afford. He was standing close to Jessica Hartwell, his hand on her shoulder, smiling like a man without a care in the world. The magnifying glass slipped from Tank's fingers and shattered on the linoleum. Ray hadn't just worked the Jessica Hartwell case. He'd known her before she disappeared. He'd been at the party where it all began, and he'd just tried to draw Tank into another conversation about ancient history that was starting to talk. Tank's phone buzzed. Now you're getting it. Your friend Ray was never the good cop. He was the cleanup crew. Another message followed immediately. Check your bank records from 1992. Then check his... Tank's hands moved without conscious thought, pulling up his old banking statements on the laptop. October 1992. There it was. A deposit of $50,000, listed as consulting fees from a company called Desert Sun Security. He'd never questioned it at the time. His sergeant had told him it was a bonus for exemplary service during a difficult period. $50,000. the same amount the Hartwell family had offered as a reward before quietly withdrawing it. Tank searched for Desert Sun Security and found nothing but a shell company that had been dissolved in 1993. But the incorporation papers listed one name he recognized: Richard Hartwell. Senator Hartwell, Jessica's father. The truth hit Tank like a physical blow. Senator Hartwell hadn't been seeking justice for his daughter. He'd been buying silence, paying off the witnesses to make sure the truth about Jessica's death and the circumstances that led to it would never surface. Tank thought about Ray's phone call, the concern in his voice, the way he'd mentioned federal protection on the case file. Ray hadn't been reaching out as a fellow cop seeking justice. He'd been probing to see how much Tank knew, how much Snake Eyes had told him, the man Tank had trusted, had worked alongside, had considered a friend. Ray had been one of them all along. Tank's bourbon-soaked mind tried to process the implications. If Ray was part of the cover-up, then the whole investigation had been theater. The sealed files, the federal protection, the quick promotion and transfer, all of it designed to contain the damage and protect the real killers. But that meant Snake Eyes was telling the truth about everything, including Mike Tyson. Tank opened a new browser window and searched for something he should have looked for 30 years ago. Mike Tyson October 1992 training camp location. Most results were vague, citing security concerns and privacy issues. But buried in a boxing forum post from 2015, he found a single line that made his blood freeze. Heard from a guy who worked security that Tyson was training at some ranch outside Reno in '92. Owner had connections to Vegas money. Place got shut down after some incident. A ranch outside Reno. Tank knew exactly which ranch. He'd driven past it 1,000 times on patrol, an isolated spread owned by a subsidiary of Hartwell Enterprises, the same property that had been sold to developers immediately after Jessica's disappearance. Tank's phone rang. Ray Kowalski's number. "Don't answer that." The voice came from behind him. Tank spun around to find a man standing in Carol's doorway. Not Snake Eyes, someone younger, harder, wearing a suit that screamed federal agent. The kind of man who cleaned up messes before they became scandals. "Mr. Morrison, I think we need to talk." Tank looked at the phone still ringing in his hand. Ray wasn't calling to help. He was calling to confirm Tank's location, to make sure the cleanup crew knew exactly where to find him. 30 years, Tank whispered. "You people have been watching me for 30 years. The man smiled, a cold professional expression that never touched his eyes. "We've been protecting you, Mr. Morrison. Same way we protected your wife. Same way we've protected everyone who's kept their mouth shut about things that never happened." "Carol?" Tank's voice cracked on her name. "Car accidents happen every day. Usually when people start asking the wrong questions." The phone stopped ringing. In the sudden silence, Tank could hear his own heartbeat and the sound of his world collapsing into dust and blood money. Tank stared at the man in his doorway, every muscle in his body coiled like a snake about to strike. The federal agent, if that's what he really was, stepped into Carol's kitchen with the casual confidence of someone who owned whatever space he occupied. His shoes clicked against the linoleum where Tank's magnifying glass lay in pieces. "You killed her," Tank said. "Not a question. A statement carved from 30 years of suppressed truth." "We didn't have to kill anyone, Mr. Morrison. Your wife had a weak heart. Stress can do terrible things to people her age." The man's eyes swept over the laptop, the photograph, the scattered evidence of Tank's discovery. "Just like your friend Snake Eyes has cancer. Just like you've been drinking yourself toward liver failure since retirement. Death comes for everyone eventually. We just manage the timing when necessary." Tank's hand inched toward the kitchen drawer where Carol kept her carving knife. The motion was subtle, but the federal agent caught it anyway. "I wouldn't. I have 3 men positioned outside, and Detective Kowalski is already en route to discuss your recent behavior with the local authorities. Seems you've been making threats against a federal witness. Unstable veteran, grief-stricken widower, history of alcohol abuse. The narrative writes itself. What federal witness?" The man's smile widened. "Why, Mr. Tyson, of course. Hero boxer who survived a vicious attack by motorcycle gang members. His testimony about that night has been invaluable in prosecuting organized crime. Can't have confused old cops muddying those waters with conspiracy theories." Tank felt the last foundation of his reality crumble. Tyson wasn't just protected, he was an active asset. The man who had orchestrated Jessica Hartwell's murder was working with the federal government, probably had been for decades. How many other crimes had been covered up? How many other bodies buried under the weight of institutional corruption? "You son of a bitch," Tank whispered. "Careful, Mr. Morrison. Threatening a federal officer is a serious crime." The man picked up Jessica's photograph, studying her young face with clinical detachment. Beautiful girl. Tragic what happened to her, but she made poor choices, got involved with dangerous people. Sometimes the innocent pay for the sins of others. She was 17. She was a liability, just like her friend who died in that car crash the week before. Just like the photographer who took this picture, apparent suicide, very sad. People connected to certain parties had an unfortunate tendency toward accidents. The man set the photo down carefully, until we learned to be more proactive about managing risks. Tank understood now why Snake Eyes had waited 30 years to reach out. Not just because he was dying, but because he'd finally realized the scope of what they were up against. This wasn't just about covering up a single murder, it was about protecting an entire network of corruption that stretched from Reno to Las Vegas to Washington, D.C. "What do you want?" Tank asked. "Your cooperation. One last time." The man reached into his jacket and produced a single sheet of paper. A simple statement explaining that you were confused about the events of October 1992. Grief and alcohol have affected your memory. You never saw anything that contradicted the official report. You have no interest in reopening old cases. Tank looked at the document, then at Carol's wedding ring still hanging on the chain around his neck. She had died believing he was a good man. Maybe that was the only truth that mattered anymore. And if I refuse, then you join your wife sooner than expected, and Snake Eyes dies screaming in a hospital bed instead of peacefully in his sleep. And Detective Kowalski discovers that his pension fund has some irregularities that require investigation, the kind that end careers and marriages. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, Tank could hear a car engine idling, the backup team, waiting for orders. He thought about Jessica Hartwell's parents going to their graves without knowing what happened to their daughter, about all the other victims whose deaths had been written off as accidents or suicides or random crime, about Carol, who had spent her last months wondering why her husband drank himself to sleep every night, muttering names she didn't recognize. Tank reached for the pen the federal agent offered him. His hand was steady now, calmer than it had been in years. He signed his name at the bottom of the document, each letter precise and deliberate. "Smart choice," the man said, folding the paper and slipping it back into his jacket. "Enjoy your retirement, Mr. Morrison. And remember, we're always watching, always protecting." The federal agent walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and that meeting tomorrow night at Mickey's Gas and Go? I'd skip it if I were you. Place has been condemned. Structural problems. Very dangerous after dark." Tank waited until the car engines faded into the distance. Then he opened Carol's laptop and began typing a new document. Not a confession, something much more dangerous. The complete truth about what happened 30 years ago, with names and dates and details that only someone who was there could know. He was done being protected. Tank typed for 3 hours straight, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the same methodical precision he'd once used to file police reports. But this wasn't a report. This was a reckoning. Every detail he could remember from that night at Mickey's Gas and Go, every conversation with Snake Eyes, every piece of evidence he'd uncovered about Jessica Hartwell's murder. He named names, listed dates, described the web of corruption that stretched from a dead gas station to the halls of power in Washington. When he finished, Tank saved the document to a flash drive and uploaded copies to 3 different cloud storage accounts Carol had set up for their photos. Then he printed 20 copies on Carol's old inkjet printer, watching the machine struggle through page after page of devastating testimony. The sun was setting when Tank's phone rang. "Snake Eyes, right on schedule. You still coming tonight?" The dying man's voice was barely a whisper now. "They know about our meeting," Tank said. "Federal agents were here. They want us to walk away." "Course they do. Question is, What are you gonna do about it? Tank looked at the stack of printed confessions on Carol's table. I'm done walking away. Good, because I got one more thing to show you, something I've been saving for last. Snake coughed, the sound like gravel in a blender. Bring a camera, Tank. World needs to see this. The line went dead. Tank gathered the printed documents and sealed them in manila envelopes, addressing each one to a different newspaper, television station, or federal prosecutor's office. The ones going to prosecutors he marked personal and confidential, old cop habit. The ones going to reporters he marked urgent. He drove to 3 different post offices across Reno, mailing the envelopes in small batches. If the federal agents were watching him, let them watch. By the time they figured out what he'd done, it would be too late to stop the avalanche. Tank's last stop was Ray Kowalski's house. The suburban ranch sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, its manicured lawn and white picket fence the picture of middle-class respectability. Ray's cruiser sat in the driveway next to a BMW that cost more than Tank's annual pension. Interesting ride for a retired cop living on a fixed income. Tank rang the doorbell and waited. Ray opened the door wearing a golf shirt and khakis, the uniform of a man who'd never worked a real day in his life. His face went through several expressions when he saw Tank: surprise, concern, then something harder and more calculating. Tank? What are you doing here? Came to ask you about Jessica Hartwell. Ray's hand tightened on the doorframe. Jesus, Tank, not you too. I thought you were smarter than Snake Eyes, so you know he's been calling me. I know everything that matters in this town. Ray stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him. Including the fact that you signed a federal document this afternoon. Smart move. Carol wouldn't have wanted you throwing your life away over ancient history. The mention of his wife's name hit Tank like a physical blow, but he kept his voice steady. Tell me about the party, Ray. The one where you met Jessica. Ray's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. I don't know what you think you know, but I know you were there. I know about the money. I know you helped them clean up the mess afterward. Tank stepped closer. What I don't know is whether you pulled the trigger yourself or just watched someone else do it. You're drunk, Ray said, but his voice lacked conviction. I'm sober for the first time in 30 years. Tank pulled out his phone and showed Ray the photograph of Jessica at the party. Federal agents think they scared me into silence. They're wrong. Ray stared at the photo, his face going pale. Tank, listen to me very carefully. There are things you don't understand, forces at work that are bigger than both of us. If you keep pushing this, what? You'll kill me too? Like you killed Carol? I didn't kill anyone! The words exploded out of Ray with desperate force. I was a facilitator, nothing more. I kept my mouth shut and took the money and tried to forget it ever happened. Same as you. Except I'm not trying to forget anymore. Tank turned and walked back to his truck, leaving Ray standing on his perfect suburban porch, like a man watching his world burn down around him. In the rearview mirror, Tank saw Ray pull out his phone and make a frantic call. Good. Let them panic. Let them scramble to contain the damage. It was too late for that now. Tank drove toward Mickey's Gas and Go with the desert wind whipping through his open windows and Carol's wedding ring bouncing against his chest. For the first time since her death, he felt like the man she'd married, the one who believed in justice and truth and doing the right thing even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Mickey's Gas and Go had been gutted by time and neglect, its windows boarded with plywood that bore the scars of graffiti and bullet holes. Tank parked his truck next to the rusted shell of Snake Eye's Harley and walked through the gap where the front door used to hang. Inside, the ghost of gasoline still haunted the air. Snake Eyes sat propped against what remained of the counter, an oxygen tank beside him, and a manila folder in his lap. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a visible struggle, but his eyes burned with the same fierce intensity Tank remembered from 30 years ago. Thought you might not come. Snake Eyes wheezed. Almost didn't. Tank settled beside him on the debris-strewn floor. Federal cleanup crew made their position clear. Good thing you're too stubborn to listen. Snake Eyes opened the folder with trembling hands. This is what they've been protecting all these years, what Tyson really did to that girl. The photographs were old Polaroids, their colors faded but still clear enough to tell the story. Jessica Hartwell at the ranch party, alive and laughing. Then the progression into horror, bruises, tears, the gradual dimming of light in her young eyes. The final shots were too terrible to study for long. Tyson kept trophies, Snake Eyes said quietly. My brothers found his stash when they went to collect what he owed us. Stupid bastard thought he was untouchable even then. Tank stared at the evidence that could have changed everything. Why didn't you come forward with these? Who was going to believe a biker over the heavyweight champion of the world? Snake Eyes coughed, flecks of blood speckling his lips. Besides, we had our own plans for justice. Was supposed to be simple. Get the photos, make him pay, end of story. Except Tyson was ready for us. The whole thing was a setup. From the minute we walked through that door, Snake Eyes' voice grew fainter. He knew we were coming, knew exactly what we wanted, had it all planned out. How it would look, who would clean it up, what story would make the news. My brothers died thinking they were hunters. Truth is, we were just prey. Tank thought about the federal agent's casual mention of Tyson as a witness, the years of protected status, the careful management of his public image. How long has he been working with them? Since before Jessica died, I'd guess. Man with appetites like his needs protection from the consequences. Snake Eyes pulled out a tape recorder, the kind police used for interviews in the early 90s. Recorded everything that night. Tyson talking about the girl, laughing about what he did to her. My insurance policy that never paid off. The tape was labeled in faded ink, October 15, 1992. Final Testament. Snake Eyes pressed play with a shaking finger. Tyson's voice filled the abandoned station, young and arrogant and utterly without conscience as he described Jessica's final hours in clinical detail. Tank listened to the confession that would have destroyed careers and toppled governments, the truth that powerful men had killed to suppress. When the tape ended, Snake Eyes ejected it and pressed it into Tank's hands. Your turn to decide what happens next. Tank looked at the cassette, then at the photographs scattered between them like evidence from a crime scene that time forgot. 30 years of silence stretched out behind him, 30 years of drinking and nightmares and Carol's gentle questions about ghosts she couldn't see. They'll kill us both if this goes public, Tank said. I'm already dead. Cancer's got maybe a week left in me. Snake Eyes smiled, the expression transforming his ravaged features. Question is, what kind of man you want to be when your time comes. Tank thought about Carol's wedding ring hanging around his neck, about the federal agent's cold smile, about Jessica Hartwell's parents dying without ever knowing the truth about their daughter. He thought about Ray Kowalski's expensive BMW and his own decades of complicity, the price of silence measured in lives destroyed and justice denied. Carol used to say the truth has its own weight, Tank said finally. Gets heavier the longer you carry it. Snake Eyes nodded. Time to set it down. Tank pocketed the tape and photographs, then helped Snake Eyes to his feet. Together they walked out of the gas station where it all began. Two old men carrying the weight of shared secrets into the desert night. Above them, the stars burned with ancient light, indifferent witnesses to human suffering and redemption. In the distance, sirens wailed, Ray Kowalski's backup arriving too late to stop what had already been set in motion. Tank thought about the envelopes he'd mailed, the confessions winging their way toward newsrooms and courthouses across the country. For the first time in 30 years, Tommy Morrison felt like himself again. The truth would have its own weight now. Someone else could carry it for a while.